Put the needle on the record, put the needle on.
Another flu, yo, that ain't our biggest threat. What about an aging population with no safety net? So we continue to believe everything we read. There just ain't no taste in their newsfeed.
Weapons of trial and error, we're smiling in terror at the doctor and nurse. Take a hold of yourself and control of your health and say no.
No, why don't you go first?
But there's one little word that can save your health. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine. If the doctor says he'll make him take it himself. Say no, no, no. Say no to the vaccine. There's one little word that could save your health. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine. And if Obama says he'll make him take it himself, just say no. Say no to the vaccine.
Don't get any injection. You never know what's in them. They're all poison.
In 1976, it was thought we were on the brink of another major flu outbreak. Medical science appeared to be prepared. The experts planned to use their best weapon yet, prevention with the flu vaccine. 500 soldiers in Fort Dix, New Jersey came down with the flu in February of 1976. Private David Lewis died, and it was determined that he had suffered from swine flu. At the time, it was feared that approximately 500 other soldiers on the base were ill with the same strain of influenza, and the alarm was sounded. In March 76, President Gerald Ford announced the biggest immunization program in history.
This virus was the cause of a pandemic in 1918 and 1919 that resulted in over 500,000 deaths in the United States.
Ford's intention was to vaccinate every man, woman, and child in the United States. Vaccine was rushed into production and imported in great quantities. The cost was to be about $135 million. And the first batch of vaccine was delivered on November 1st. The first public swine flu clinic opened 3 weeks later. From the beginning, the program was criticized for being hastily implemented and unnecessary. But over 50 million people in North America were inoculated at a cost of $100 million before investigators discovered an apparent increase in a rare paralytic disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome among the recently vaccinated. This and the fact that the epidemic failed to materialize led to a quick end to the vaccination program in December 1976.
Researchers and experts now fear that the failure of the swine flu epidemic to materialize in '76 will have detrimental effects on preparations for future pandemics. Dr. Arthur Silverstein was an advisor to the U.S. Senate Health Committee in 1976 and has written a book about the swine flu scare. Dr. Silverstein, you called your book about the experiences of '76 pure politics, impure science. Why is that the right image for those experiences?
I think it's the right image because whereas one still didn't then and still doesn't know all that much about the science of influenza virus, one knows a fair amount about how politics works in Washington. And politics worked very smoothly, although the science did not in the '76 flu outbreak.
Now, let me say, I'm going to spend the first part of this presentation talking about swine flu, but I'm going to offer the caveat that I'm not a medical practitioner. So I would absolutely encourage not a single one of you to take anything that I say at face value. There is no need to, because during the course of the presentation, I'm going to explain the references, so you can go check this stuff out for yourself. And in my opinion, over the coming weeks, there has never been a time when it's been more important to educate yourself. Now, that little video was put together by a guy called Jody Lloyd in New Zealand. He lives in Christchurch, New Zealand. And he's a young guy. He performs under the name of Trillion. And I think he has demonstrated that all around the world, people are starting to make the effort to educate themselves. And so they should, because we don't have to look too hard to see the first piece of a jigsaw that should give us some serious cause for concern. Because do you know who the architect was behind the 1976 swine flu outbreak? The architect was none other than Donald Rumsfeld. Isn't it amazing how often this guy crops up? And of course, his buddy, Cheney, is never far behind. And these guys have a political career that goes back sort of some 40-odd years. So these guys are extremely practiced in the art of manipulation. And Donald Rumsfeld dreamed up the swine flu scam in 1976 to provide a sort of wag the dog type scenario for President Gerald Ford, who was struggling in the primaries against his opponent, who was a guy who went by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush. So the idea was that it does appear that one person died of swine flu at Fort Dix, one person. And they used that as the basis with which to announce a swine flu epidemic, pandemic. Ford signed off $135 million for the vaccine and started a program of mass inoculation. Unfortunately, or fortunately I should say, very quickly, it was identified that there were some pretty serious effects from the vaccination, up to and including death, which is the caveat that these drug makers offer on all of their commercials in the US. So, and as you heard on the video there, the other spin-off was a massive spread of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which was also known as infantile paralysis, and this affects the nervous system. So it was obviously not good PR, so it was very quickly buried. And, of course, actually, Ford didn't get re-elected. He was replaced by Jimmy Carter, who was a protege of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And, of course, we have a protege of Zbigniew Brzezinski in the White House right now. So you see how the players, the same players, keep cropping up. But let's just take a look here at some of the other things very quickly that Rumsfeld's hand can be spotted in. Oh, that's a better picture of Rumsfeld. So he's Mr. Aspartame as well, of course, because he was the CEO of Searle when aspartame was developed, couldn't get it into the food chain. So he put a phenomenal amount of money behind Reagan's presidential campaign, and the moment Reagan was sworn in on the White House lawn, Rumsfeld reminded him that he owed him one and got him to change the head of the Food and Drug Administration, the guy who had prevented aspartame from going into the food chain. By May of that year, aspartame was in the food chain. Later, Rumsfeld was instrumental in selling Searle to Monsanto. He personally made $15 million on the deal. He was the chief executive of a company called Gilead Sciences from 1995 until 2001, when he was invited to become Secretary of State for Defense by George W. Bush. Whilst he was head of Gilead Sciences, the company developed a drug that we know today as Tamiflu. They had no idea what to do with it, so they actually sold the marketing rights to a company called Roche, a Swiss pharmaceutical company. And it shouldn't be any great surprise that nobody had really heard of Tamiflu until Rumsfeld is Secretary of State for Defense. And it's not too many years later that we hear the first mention of bird flu, and lo and behold, the magic formula to counter the coming pandemic for bird flu is Tamiflu. Amazing. And of course, he was also one of the major architects whilst he was CEO of Gilead. He was a member of the right-wing think tank group, the Project for a New American Century. He was one of the signatories on a letter sent to Clinton in 1998 requesting that Clinton actually invade Iraq. Clinton obviously chose to ignore the letter. So they wrote a much longer strategy document, which is called Rebuilding America's Defenses, which was published in September of 2000, exactly 1 year before 9/11. And of course, on 9/11, Rumsfeld, well, we still don't know exactly where he was, but apparently he was purportedly in the other side of the Pentagon, about as far away as you could get from the wall that was actually hit by whatever. But of course, the day before, on September the 10th, one of his direct subordinates, a guy called Rabbi Dov Zakheim, appeared before the media to announce that the Pentagon could not account for $2.3 trillion. And of course, that was all lost in the events the following day. I mean, how could he have known? How could he have known that September the 10th was an amazing day to bury bad news?